Okay, you guys, I think we are live in our group. You are watching this. Let me also record this so we can use. Okay, good morning, guys. I'm Sarbjeet. You guys are watching this in the Business Analyst in Demand Facebook group or YouTube channel. So today, this week, we'll be covering week 8 of Acme Solutions. We've been doing this. I started this a little while ago and then stopped because there wasn't a lot of interest in it, but then we're picking it up again. This week, we're going to be covering the Sprint Planning, Sprint Grooming titles for Agile project management. So if you guys been following the videos before, what we've been doing is we picked up a case study. It's a make-believe system. We're building an application, an app on iOS and Android for a hotel system that allows, I believe, staff members, hotel staff, the cleaning staff, to allows them to check in, provide their availability. Admins and managers can assign rooms to them to be cleaned and assign the different types of cleaning that needs to happen. So throughout this case study, what I've done is I've tried to give you guys a framework that you would use in managing a case study if you had to do one for your job interview, or even if you were working as a business analyst and you could use the frameworks and the process that I've used in this case study to do your day-to-day job. So it gives you a framework of what the day-to-day role of a business analyst looks like, okay? So any questions on the case study before we dive into sprint planning?
Can we find the full case study on Facebook, the document itself?
Which document?
The case study. Do you have like a written case study, like on a document or?
Oh, dude, we've been doing this. This is week 8. So we've covered the background and everything. It's all in Facebook and YouTube channel if you want to go back and watch it.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. So it's all there, dude. You'll find everything. So we've started from, identifying what the business problem is. We've created workflow diagrams. We've created a user, not a user story. We did create user stories, but we created a use case diagram for it to identify what the different roles and what access they would need. We created a product backlog, user stories. Last week we created user stories, and this week we're going to focus on sprint planning. Okay, so what I did in the group is I asked a bunch of you guys to help me write user stories for this, for us to do sprint planning, right? You can't do sprint planning without having a list, a detailed list of user stories that are ready. So let me focus on how do you do sprint planning? So if you're not familiar with the Agile environment, what we work on generally is we have a list of features that we want to work on. And all of those features live in the product backlog, right? So any features that we want to work on for a particular project, right? So each project would have its own product backlog. So a product backlog is nothing more than a list of features or things that we want to work on for the project. And then as a team, we identify the priority of those feature lists, like high, medium, and low, based on where we see as a project team how those things, fare out. So there may be things that are higher priority because we're trying to get them to speed to market sooner than later, right? There may be nice to have features that we want to work on at some point, but maybe not for the MVP, which is a minimal viable product. So as a project team, we do go in and we prioritize what those things look like. Now, for sprint planning to be successful, right, there's a number of ways that we can take a look at this. Let me show you what I created last night. I created this Excel spreadsheet. As I said, I've asked many of you guys in our group to help me create user stories so we could have successful sprint planning, and many of you guys did. So I'm not gonna take a look at the user stories and or talk about how good or bad they are. We're gonna assume that we're all expert BAs in the group and that all the user stories are written properly. So we're not gonna look at how the user stories are written, but I just want to go through the motions of how sprint planning takes place. So what I've done here is I've given an ID to each of the user stories. Here's the product backlog that I was talking about. So generally when we start a project in Agile, we have something called the features list or things that we want to accomplish with the project, right? So that becomes your product backlog, which is nothing more than a list of features that you have for the project. Then we go in, we may as a team start to prioritize what those things look like. And then at the user story level, these are the detailed requirements that our dev and QA teams need to look at when things get pulled into a sprint. A sprint is nothing more than the active dev cycle that our teams are working on. Sprints are usually 2 to 3 to 4 weeks long. Generally, I've seen 2 weeks long, but there are companies that have sprints that are 4 weeks long. So what does sprint planning mean? Sprint planning is let's say if our company or our team is working on a 2-week sprint cycle, before that 2 weeks sprint cycle begins, we spend a couple of hours at the beginning of the sprint identifying the user stories that will be pulled in to the product backlog. So I'll pause there to see if you guys have any questions on the terms that I just threw out. Sprint planning, product backlog, any of those items. Okay. So once you have your product backlog, once it is identified as high priority. So an interview question that I get a lot from you guys is, hey, Sarabjit, when a sprint is ongoing, what should our Scrum Master / BA / product owner be doing? And what they should be doing is something called backlog grooming, right? What that means is you'll see that there are things in the product backlog that are identified as high, but they don't have user stories. So as our developers are busy coding in a sprint, what you guys should be focused on is looking at the product backlog and looking at high priority items and start to detail out those user stories. To create these user stories is not something that you would create in a vacuum anyway, right? To identify and create these user stories, you typically need to work with your product owner. All right, so the book definition says that the product owner should be the one to write out user stories, right? But in reality, the product owner can or cannot be the one writing the user stories. Most of the time, I've seen the Scrum Master or the BA on the team, if there is a BA writing user stories. So if as your dev teams are busy working on the current sprint, what you as a business analyst or a Scrum Master or product owner should be doing is looking at the product backlog at the high priority items on the product backlog and detailing out the user stories. Last week's session, not last week, but the week before, we covered the format of user stories and how they should be looking. So some of these user stories are identified in that format, but I haven't, for this week's training, I haven't looked at the user stories to make sure that they're written properly. Like I said, we're gonna assume that everything looks awesome. You guys are expert business analysts, and all we're gonna do is sprint planning. Okay.
Good morning, Sarabjit. Got a question here. Yep. So you said about the priority. Who put the priority there? Like this user story is high or medium? Who does that?
So usually it's in Agile, we talk about it being a team effort, right? So there are some areas where the product owners would identify the priority. Hang on just a second. I didn't know. But it's not here. Thank you. But I took anyway. I'll help you find it later. Sorry, you guys, my little one is looking for a book. So I know going back to your question, there's different ways that priority could be assigned. Lots of areas, Agile is supposed to be like a team effort, right? So there may be product owners that are passionate about some things because they're speed to market from a business standpoint and could go in to the product backlog and identify those things that are identified as MVP as high, medium, or low. Generally, what we do is we work in a team environment and we review each of the items on the backlog and we identify priority, because this is how we know to start writing user stories out for those. This is how we know that our dev teams can go into Jira. I put this in Excel, but generally you will find something like this in Jira to go in and to start writing, estimating like the story points it would take us to build those things out.
So can I say that if we put the user story in Jira, all the invitees gets the notification of the user stories are there. Someone reads it, and probably that's a product owner, and then he applies the techniques like Moscow or some other techniques, and he prioritizes each story.
Yeah, that would be an accurate statement. However, there are many different companies that use many different techniques for this, right? A product owner could be the one to assign the prioritization, or it could be a team effort.
Okay, right? Like I'm talking about a user story where 100 of them is written. So I'm sure they cannot go for all those 100. How do they put like high, medium there? That's what I was thinking.
So that's why we identify something called the minimal viable product, right? Speed to market is a big deal in Agile. So there's always different phases that we identify things that need to happen. And from those things, out of the 100 user stories that we may have in the system, I'm sure it's probably 100 things on the product backlog and not 100 user stories, because that's not what we do in Agile, right? We generally, it's just in time requirements, right? We're not gonna spend 3 months writing 100 user stories versus writing those that we want to work on before the others, right? So in each scenario, when we're looking at building out, let's say an app, there's something called the MVP, right? So minimal viable product, speed to market is the first release that we're going to have. After that, there may be other features that from a business standpoint make the most sense, or from a dev standpoint makes the most sense. So then we'll target those things on the product backlog, and from there we'll identify high, medium, and low.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So going back, I lost my train of thought. Any other questions before I figured out where I was going with that? Okay. So again, generally I've seen sprint planning happening in 2 different ways. In some of my projects, what will happen is I will tell, before the sprint planning has begun, I will tell my dev team or my dev leads to say, go into the product backlog, anything that's identified as high, right, and has complete user stories, right, go in and tell me how many story points those items are. And when that happens, it allows us to understand how many story points we can take in for the upcoming sprint, right? And we'll talk about team velocity and story points in just a bit. But generally, there's 2 ways that I personally have seen this happen. Again, many companies operate in many different ways. In my training in this group and in my other personal training sessions, I only teach you guys what I've done in my career. Okay, so there's 2 different ways that I've seen happen. The first one is I'll tell my dev leads to go into the product backlog, anything that's high and has complete user stories, right? These 3 do not. So there's no way they can give me estimates, and there's no way we can pull in these user stories, regardless of them being high, into a sprint because they're not ready, right? So we only focus on, high priority items that have complete user stories. So in this case, my dev lead would go in here and give me story points, and they would also add task level items that need to be completed for this user story to be done, right? The other method that I've seen is we schedule a sprint planning session, right? So your product owner is there, your dev leads are there, your dev team members are there, QA, Scrum Master, BA, if there is one on the team. We all get into a room, virtually nowadays, and we look at the product backlog and we look at high priority items, and then we also focus only on completed user stories, and we talk about the user stories, right? We say, okay, for this download, how many story points is it? And we list those out in Jira. And if there are tasks associated, like here last night, when I was reading this user story, this one is to register as a staff on the registration screen. The user story reads, as a staff member, I want to register on the app so that I can provide my availability and understand my assignments for cleaning rooms. Given that I've downloaded the app, when I provide my employee ID, then I'm prompted to provide the following items for registration: name, phone number, password, and email. And the tasks that, as talking about this user story with my project team, my dev leads would say, okay, Sarabjit, that means that we need to create front-end pages, right, that are for staff. We need to send an email, and then we need to reset the password, the reset password page. So maybe I copied this from a different user story that probably doesn't makes more sense. But in any case, what I'm trying to showcase is, as we're doing this in a team, my dev team members will think about and tell me what items need to be completed for this user story to be done. And in doing so, this helps us estimate how long it will take from a coding standpoint. How many story points should we associate to this particular user story? Okay, and these task level items can be created in Jira and assigned to different dev resources. So generally we see a front-end developer, a back-end developer, or a full-stack developer. So a front-end developer would work on front-facing screens, like the look and feel is more important to them. A back-end developer probably would focus more on databases, and a full-stack developer, somebody that's has experience and expertise in building front-end and back-end pages. So that's generally how we spend time. Generally, sprint planning is 4 hours, and we just go through things in the product backlog. We talk about it, we create task level items, and we assign story points to that. Now, what do story points mean? So story points, generally one story point equals 8 hours of coding. And there's again, many different ways of estimating in Agile. The one that I am most familiar with, the one that I've worked with my dev teams with, is one story point equals 8 hours of coding. So now if something takes 4 hours of coding, that would be a half a story point, right? And then we have something called team velocity. Team velocity is generally, on average, how many user stories or how many story points does my dev lead or does my dev team can they accomplish in a given sprint, right? Team velocity is not something that you would know when you first start. Let's say, for example, you have a brand new Scrum team. We are working on our first sprint. There's no way for you to know what the average number of story points my dev team can complete without going through this motion a couple of times, right? So let's say by the third or fourth sprint, you kind of can gauge how many story points your dev team can complete. And based on that number, you would pull in the number of story points into a sprint, given your team velocity, knowing how many story points your team can accomplish or not. Okay, so I've said a lot. Any questions so far? You guys are just blown away with this information, aren't you? I've made everything super duper clear. Okay, so we're gonna pretend that our team is an expert dev team, and our team velocity is 20 story points. We have 2 to 3 developers on the team, and it's simple math, right, guys? So 20 story points, right, equals 8 hours. 20 story points equals 8 hours. It gives me, let's say if my sprint is 2 weeks, that means that my team will accomplish 320 hours worth of coding. Now let's say if I have 3 developers on the team, that means that each week, so this is 2, right? So that's the output for 2 weeks. So each week they will be working 53 hours, right? This is assuming if I have, how many developers did I say? 3 developers. Now let's say if I had 4 developers, Again, this math is not important. I just wanted to show you guys that, this is generally how we're thinking about things when we're looking at, lots of times I get questions on, Sarajit, how do you know a project in Agile, how long it's going to take? And generally we could do that if you have high level estimation on your user stories to know, to create like a baseline, how long a project would take. But let's assume that we're not trying to solve that problem for today. We're in a sprint planning session. Last night I was assigning user stories just based on things that I, just making stuff up. I'm not a developer. So for this exercise, I'll just assign, story points here so we can finish out sprint planning. So now, what it looks like is for all the things that we have already, here are the story points for this sprint. And it equals to 16 story points. And our velocity is 20. So sometimes I get questions like, so if the velocity is 20 and could we pull in only 16? Yes, you can, right? The reason that you would only pull in 16, even though our velocity is 20, is because none of the other user stories are ready for us to take in, right? In Agile, we never want to take in a user story that's not ready, that where the requirements are not flushed out, where we don't have like a design to associate it with the user story, because the thought process is we don't want to waste time for anybody on the project team. Once a sprint has started, you generally don't, it's like heads down work for the entire team to make sure that everything that's pulled into that sprint will go, will be delivered at the end of those 2 weeks. Okay, questions? No questions?
Too much information, I guess.
Information overload. All right, well, this training is going to be in the group. Watch it again. If you have any questions after the fact, let me know. And I'm always here to support you guys.
Thank you.
Yep. Jude, you okay?
Yep. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah. Shweta, welcome. I believe this is the first time you're joining these sessions. She's also very, very blown away with this information. All right, guys, I will catch you guys later. I will hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys shortly. Bye.